The 1950s Australian home. The 50s being the time between the Art Deco and mid-century eras, it was a time of evolution and experimentation in Australian architecture. It was the period after the usual Victorian, Federation, Art Deco and Californian bungalow houses were present. It was architecture where houses before this time were being built using basic materials like brick for designs, not excelling past the usual and standardized Australian home, where designs for houses were almost getting copied and pasted down the street and not one standing out from a crowd. The architectural movement that Australians have embraced more than any other is the mid-century modernism movement, post-war architecture at its finest. After World War II ended, the boom for modernist-style homes were constructed across the nation. Big names now known in architecture came from all across the world to uphold and invest in this new craze for modern-styled homes that were one of a kind. Modern design living is very open-space living. The modern home is design homes that feature a strong horizontal composition with large open floor plans, intentional symmetry and large expanses of glass windows or glass walls. Architects including one of the biggest names of the local modernist movement, Harry Seidler, was of help to create this shift in architecture in Australia. Harry Seidler was born in Vienna in 1923 with the Nazi occupation of Austria in 1938. At the age of 15, Harry joined his brother Marcel in England where he studied building. It wasn't until the late 1942 when Harry was able to study architecture at the University of Manitoba, Winnipeg, which then soon later allowed him to become a registered architect in Canada. In Seidler's earlier stages before his incredible career he is known for today, he won a scholarship to the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he studied under the pioneering founder of the Bauhaus, Walter Gropius. He then graduated from Harvard in 1946 as an enthusiastic and committed modernist. He married in 1958 to Penelope Seidler after meeting her in 1957 at Sydney University, by which she was enrolled in architecture. Harry started his postgraduate life in New York and didn't move his career over to Australia until after his mother Rose enticed him to Australia with the offer of designing and building a house for her and Harry's father Max, which was soon to become one of the most popular houses built within the mid-century modernism era, the Rose Seidler House. He arrived in Sydney in 1948, where he thought he would only remain until the house was built. However, the architectural success that followed suggested he should stay, as headings of being considered the forefather of modernist architecture in Australia. The modern architect's design philosophy is based on consequential methodology of approach by which social use, technology, and aesthetic expression was relevant. He was constantly striving to challenge conformity. Every designer is influenced by others, and for Seidler, it was the 20th century modern masters Walter Gropius, Marcel Breuer, and Oscar Niemeyer. His work was looked at and recognized by his own signature style. However, he still worked and collaborated with other architects as they embraced the new technologies the architecture period offered. The definitions of the key terms of modernism, modernity, and modernization are well further developed and recognized in Seidler's work through examples such as the Rose Seidler House and the Harry and Penelope Seidler House. The Rose Seidler House had begun being built in 1948, where there was no such thing as modern architecture in Australia. Although this was a time after the Second World War and jobs in building and trade were only just becoming popular, as they were in high demand for architects like Seidler to help grow the architectural development in Australia. During this time, finding the proper materials was also difficult as it was post-war and there were still lots of shortages of materials. This house is historically significant as a resource to demonstrate the many features of modernist art, architecture, and design theory. Seidler's American take on modernism contrasted with the European modernism of early Australian adapters such as Sydney Anchor and Robin Boyd, which allowed his early homes from 1949 to 54 establish an authentic version of modern architecture. After finishing the Rose Seidler House, Seidler was getting titles that said things like he grabbed Australia by the scruff of the neck and shook it. With his bringing of modernism to Australia, it was said that the house, although commissioned in Australia, seemed to be from another world. Being built following after the war years and the Depression, the house brought a fresh optimism to add to the housing industry. The Rose Seidler House brought great contrast to the normal houses being built in Sydney suburbia, with Seidler's futuristic approach rather than traditional. He demonstrated the modernist belief that the quality of life can be improved by functional and flexible design, with his design ideas for the stark cube-like form house as it reflected his concerns for simplicity and function. The house was the front-running example of the mid-century modern domestic architecture in Australia, however raised great social, common and intellectual debate as it was controversial when being built. Harry said during this time that there was no modern architecture to speak of in Australia then, and the house I built for my mother caused quite a stir. It brought an almost immediate list of clients who wanted something just like it. At first, they were all European immigrants to whom this new architecture was somewhat familiar. But what amazed me was the average Australians who came up and wanted uncompromisingly modern homes. This was a great deal for Seidler, as it meant, although unlucky few comments on the new style of home that he had built, he had also won over many Australians into taking the plunge into the unknown world of modernism that he helped create. His work gave form to a modern identity for New Age. He had planned to return to the United States after completing houses for his family, but found himself in high demand to design similar houses for which were most for European arrivals who were familiar with the modernist design. There were Australians seeking for some other than the traditional brick house and responded so well with Seidler's idea of houses being designed to be more open to the outdoors, the warm climate, and to reflect informal lifestyle. Another great example of Harry Seidler's work that contributed to the change of Australian architecture was the 1967 Harry and Penelope Seidler house, built by both Harry and Penelope in Killara, New South Wales. This family home, designed for Seidler's own immediate family, showed that within a decade his ideas had developed in a different direction, becoming stunned to the Australian climate and focused on a connection to the outdoors. This house was when he began exploring concrete construction for its flexibility and thermal mass. The Killara house was what embodied much of his new thinking and new typology for suburbia. Harry Seidler used modern materials and technologies for these two houses. He had incorporated many examples of modern domestic technology and commercial products that were introduced into Australia in the 50s. These technologies included things like electrical appliances, labour-saving devices, materials, fittings, and storage systems. The Rose Seidler house constructed of 4 basic materials, being natural bush stone, reinforced concrete, timber, and glass, and the Killara house used materials of reinforced concrete, rubble stonework, white concrete, block work, and Tasmanian oak for boarded ceilings. Harry Seidler's work expresses the present modern design principles and modern design elements such as alignment, balance, contrast, movement, white space, colour choices, textures, shapes, and lines of furniture, and also the inclusion of tension between industrial and natural elements. Harry Seidler once said that the mid-century modernism was a framework on which to hang every different and potentially changing images. Modern architecture could never be a style per se. It must remain in constant flux, responding not only to regional differences and social demands, but also reflecting the changing visual language and the ever-expanding wealth of technological means. In relation to Australian architect to the present day, contemporary architect Glenn Murcutt is Australia's most internationally recognised architect, with multiple awards won such as the Gold Medal of the Australian Institute of Architects in 1992 and again in 2009, the National Honour Order of Australia in 1996, and the Pritzker Prize, considered equivalent to the Nobel Prize for Architecture in 2002. It can be seen as to why he's so highly recognised in his work. With love for organic architecture that fits into the landscape and connects to nature, and his early exposure to simple architecture can be connected to Seidler's work. He often works in materials that can only be produced and locally sourced, such as glass, stone, brick, concrete, and corrugated metal. He works as a sole practitioner, primarily designing environmentally sensitive modernist houses that respond to their surroundings and climate. Ways that the contemporary designer can be linked to Seidler's work, being a historical designer, is through his use of curves, the use of easily sourced materials, including concrete and glass, the wide glass openings, large space open living, and share the same theories of making the house fit into the landscape instead of replacing the surroundings. We can see how the modern world is frequently changing due to social form and the ever-changing and developing world, as well as how old modern architecture design is still used for inspiration for contemporary designers today.